Japanese said gentle wind. Gentle wind, I think. And that was named after a jet fighter, Soyokaze. Everybody called him Smiley, yeah. I guess he must have smiled a lot. I don't know.
I'm sure it's because he smiled all the time. Yeah, I can just remember he had gold teeth in the front and, yeah, very slight man, yeah. Good fisherman, definitely. And it's amazing, I mean, how a family turns a boat into an industry. You know, and they're pretty prominent in the fishing industry.
Over the years, they became such economic competitors that there was a lot of conflict between Japanese and non-Japanese fishers, and because they didn't have the right to vote, they had no influence over politicians. And so at election time, they became scapegoats for every economic ill that, you know, that was happening in the province. And then I think there was also the superiority complex, or what some people say, white supremacy. And so when they saw some Nikkei becoming quite successful, the attitude was, you know, you're supposed to be below us, not at par, right? So that was an issue. The 1920s was especially difficult for Nikkei fishermen because the federal government brought in policies with the goal to eliminate all Japanese from the fishing industry over in the shortest possible time.
It was tough at that time. I guess they didn't have no running water, or only way to heat the place with wood, right? Cook with wood stove too. And they lived next to my dad's uncle.
The War Measures Act gave the federal government absolute power, and so nothing had to be debated in court or in Parliament, and also the reasoning, for instance, for the Japanese being removed from the coast was national security. But then the RCMP and I think it was the Navy, they said, no, it's not a necessity because we have everything under control. This is not necessary. But, you know, reason and common sense and several liberties got trumped by, you know, war hysteria, racism at the time. The bombing of Pearl Harbor was on December the 7th, I think. And then within 48 hours, all Nikkei fishermen were, well, the vessels, I guess, owned by Nikkei fishermen were called into the nearest port. And there they were confiscated, and unbeknownst to the fishermen, were ready for sale. So that I think by the first week in January, the Japanese Fishing Vessels Disposal Committee was formed. And the fishermen really felt that this was a temporary thing, that they had nothing to worry about. And then also they cooperated with the roundup of their boats because to them it was a sign of loyalty. And they looked at non-cooperation as being disloyal. So you sort of wonder, why would they participate in bringing their own boats from, say, the Skeena River through the December storm to, I think it was to Annieville. And why would they participate in that? But they felt that that was their way of showing their loyalty to Canada, right? And so that's how it happened. My father, well, you know, indignantly, I asked him, well, why didn't you do something? Like, to me, I guess of my generation, it's a natural question to ask. And he said, I tried. He said, I went to the wharf and tried to get on my boat, but I was stopped by a sailor who put a rifle to my chest, right? And then at that point, my mother piped up and said, you know, what good would it have done to the family to have your dad in jail? And that's exactly what happened to people who protested. Even if for minor offenses like staying out after curfew, or not carrying their alien registration card, or protesting the separation of the men from the rest of the family. So that's the environment at that time. What happened was they were advertised for sale, and there were 1,137 vessels that were confiscated. They were all owned by Japanese Canadians. The unfortunate part was that because they were all being sold at the same time, it oversaturated the market. And so what the Nikkei felt was the value of the boat, and what it was bought for were two different things. Some of them did not get, some of them, the owners would not sign over the boats. They said, no, I won't. And they were in internment camp. So what happened was they were sold without their consent. But the fishers really felt that they didn't get fair value for their boats. And I should mention the kind of the relationship of the fishermen to their boat. It wasn't just a vessel for making a living. It was, it served as its shelter in stormy weather, right? It was their investment, a symbol of their success. And so I know one fisherman said, you know, when I had to sign over my boat, it was like being cut off at the root. Yeah, and I would imagine that's how Mr. Matsunaga felt. No one has really talked about that emotional and psychological stress that the internment caused, the confiscation, the selling off, because it wasn't just the boats that were sold off, it was also all their property, right? My grandmother said, you know, there's nothing to come back to. Absolutely everything was sort of so-called being held in trust, when it turned out not to be held at all. We were only allowed to take, if you're an adult, 150 pounds, 50 pounds for kids, or 50 or 75 pounds. And so when you're thinking that you're going to be back, you don't take your best things with you, right? You just take the things, oh, well, you know, I'll just take my ratty old clothes. And so most of the, of what you treasured were left behind and sold off. I mean, they were treasures to us, but then junk to somebody else, I would imagine.
But I heard we were all gathered up in Hastings Park. That from there we went to Taylor Lake, Bridge River, and then Lillooet. And from Lillooet we came to Quathiaski Cove.
Well, I remember living in Lillooet. So I was 6 years old when we left Lillooet. So I remember a little bit, That's about it.
The fishers who came back, I think it was only about 10% or something like that. And then, you know, we have friends who say, we'll never come back to BC. It was just too painful. They would come back and visit friends, right? But no, not to live. Before the war, or before 1949. Yeah, well, it would be before 1942 because they were no longer fishing. The Nikkei fishers were not allowed to fish the whole coast. They could fish in certain districts, right? So you had to take out a license for that one district. You couldn't fish the whole coast, whereas non-Japanese could. But then after they came back, well, first of all, in 1949, we were given the franchise. We could come back to the coast. Fishermen could fish the whole coast, and they were not barred from the most lucrative trolling areas. That was another thing. And so they really felt that they had an equal chance of making a success.
Came on that, I'm not quite sure, is it Chirosen, the name of that? We came on that, and my dad promised me when coming in, there's a store right at where the boat docks. And it docked about 6 o'clock, I guess, in the store where he was supposed to buy me candy. And the store was closed. Yeah, I remember that day.
Quathiaski Cove, right where the ferry landing is. My dad bought when he first came to the Quathiaski Cove, he was renting the house, old house, for $20 a month, right? And then after that, a few years, he bought the house.
And Mr. Matsunaga was looking for his for Soyokaze, right? And I was thinking that, you know, knowing how they feel about their boats, that emotional attachment to the boats, I can understand why he was looking for his old boat, because his boat was built in 1938, so it wasn't very old. And I would imagine that he has such great pride in that boat. But anyway, they couldn't find it, so they bought other boats. And then, in I think it was 1957, another fisherman, found Mr. Matsunaga's boat. It was named the North Star or something like that, wasn't it? And said, you know, he wanted to buy the boat because I would imagine it was in pretty good condition. In fact, I think it was. And the owner, which I've never been able to identify, takes a little bit more research, I think, but he said, well, I'm only going to sell it to the original owner, right, Mr. Matsunaga.
Yeah, he said, well, he fished, first boat he bought was the little cod boat from Nanaimo. He fished that for about 2-3 years, and then he bought the Terry Q, a local boat that was in Quad Island, and he fished that till 57. That's when he bought the Soyokaze.
Salmon fishing was the mainstay, right? Cod fishers were fewer in number. For a couple of reasons. One, because the season was long. They started in March and went till December, I think it was, December 31st. And not only that, the pay was terrible, right? It was starvation sort of thing. It was labor intensive, and it also meant that you had to have in-depth knowledge of the areas that you would be fishing in, and so they had to know about the local area, the tides, the current, the reefs. They had to be skillful navigators, and they also had to apparently know how to triangulate so they could find the perfect fishing holes, the hot spots as they call them, right?
I can remember as a young boy, in April, the Japanese cod fishing fleet would show up in this area, and all around Quathiaski Cove they would have herring boxes, and it was just, you know, like every little place they could put one and anchor it, and they fished out of there, and then the Matsunagas had their camp scow that processed the product. Mm-hmm. And it just became very busy. It was a whole industry.
When I was probably late 50s, 8 years old to early 60s, I started going cod fishing with Dad. Me and Sam, my brother Sam mostly. I spent a lot of time on a little boat called Saki. He bought it from Richmond. We went out and caught the bait first. Before March the 1st, that's when cod fishing opened. We'd go out with little nets, probably, we just pulled by hand, so they weren't very heavy. We'd go along, a lot of times we got it out in Harriet Bay area, out in Franciscan Point. The herring spawned all along that beach, right into Harriet Bay. There was herring spawning. We'd go a lot of times setting over there. And it was kind of neat because all these little boats would come together and tie on the cork lines, and we'd all be brailing our bait. So we'd fill the boats right up. And Dad made his herring pond out of cedar shakes, long boards, split by hand, and he actually carved them flat. And Matsunaga family they had their bait ponds. In fact, we fished together and filled their ponds and our ponds. We worked together with them. Everybody shared our bait. And the great times, I could remember going to Quadra to get bait, and Smiley and Tack and them was all on their boats, waving at each other, families, Sam's family going in, and you know, just good old days, going cod fishing with their dad. Wow, what a time that was. And I could, plain as day, I could see all them guys on their boats waving away and good luck and whatever. It was pretty neat times.
And we started fishing from 1st of March to end of November. Mostly out the Cape and sometime inside the Seymour Narrows. Like you said, we have coffee at home and leave home around 8, 9 o'clock in the morning and home on supper time, depending on how the fishing is. And the fishing is good, sometimes we put in extra couple hours, eh? And them days the fishing was good too.
And they had the Terry Q and the North Star, and Tack ran the Terry Q, and Sam was on there, and Frank was with their dad, and little Joe. Joe was involved mostly with buying the cod when he got older. But yeah, they all worked together, kind of like our family. And it was kind of neat to see, you know, both big families. Wow. I think there was how many sons they had. You know, they worked together as they went and created a lot working together, that family.
I've known them all my life. Grew up with them. Myself and my sister and brother were babysat as children. Mm-hmm. And my dad's little house, when they first built a house in Quadra, was right at the gate of the Matsunaga's property. Yeah. So that's when it all started. The Soyokaze, when I first saw it as a youngster, it was called the North Star. And I'm not positive, but I think it was 1957 that they bought it back. And it still had the cabin on the stern. And then, I don't know, a couple of years later, I think they took that off and turned it into a gill knitter too, as a cod boat and gill knitter. But as kids, we used to go down, they had a floating camp scow in the cove, and we used to go down and unload the fish off that boat when it first came back. We used to clean codfish and ice them, and you know, it was just fun. It was definitely, that was enjoying what we were doing.
The Matsunagas bought the fish off us. They had a little scow set up, and then later on, Tack and his family got a barge, and it was anchored out by the lighthouse, tied on the pilings. And we sold the cod there a lot, and then it moved to the breakwater there. And they bought all our fish off us. Back then it was 10 cents a pound, you know. Yeah, those were good times. The livers were 5 cents a pound, I think. I used to be just a little guy picking up the livers and putting them in the yellow cans, 5-pound cans. Yeah, I'd pick it up, put it in there. We get 5 cents a pound for the liver. Cod liver oil.
Up to the day he fished, it was in good condition, but then it deteriorated because we didn't. Well, we painted, the bottom was in good shape, but the top started rotting. Yeah, well, yeah, it needed a lot of work. Yeah, he always said he wanted to donate the boat if they would accept it. He'd be happy if he could donate it.
We quickly became aware that it wasn't just about the fact that it was a fishing boat, but that it had been taken away during internment, and we wanted to tell that story as well. And I think it was really important, not only to the Japanese community. I think it was important for a lot of the locals who, some of them didn't and probably still don't completely understand what some of the local Japanese went through during internment, because they literally took the boats away from them and their homes and everything else and sent them out to the camps.
Buford Haynes and a couple others from the commercial fishing exhibit, I don't know if they made an appointment or not, but I remember them sitting behind my desk and saying, there's a boat at the dock there that's really deteriorating, and it's an important part of our history. And we've come here on behalf of Mr. Matsunaga, because he's not well and he's probably too modest to come. But the boat is deteriorating, he's aging, and we really feel there's some urgency to it. And so I started asking around, and I met with the Matsunaga family, and I think he might have even been in and out of the hospital at that time. And they confirmed that they'd be thrilled if the museum could take it on, because they felt there was important education there for future generations. It was in rough shape. It was, again, perhaps more of a challenge we knew. And I was out of my depth, so I called a marine surveyor in to assess the situation of it. I researched other maritime museums and boats across Canada to see whether we should keep it in the water and display it in the water, and what would be the pros and cons of that, or dry dock it and keep it at the museum site. At the end of the day, the advice seemed to be more, the majority of the advice was keep it dry docked.
So we had to also make the decision that we were going to refurbish it as it was when it was the original boat. So the Matsunagas, who were really helpful in pictures and helping us sort through some of those issues, the Japanese community out of Vancouver got wind of it, and they were very supportive too.
So we pulled it out of the water, and again with business help, and it sat in our backyard with a lot of scraping and sanding, and for a while there we weren't sure whether the boat would ever come back together again. George and Sandra kept the Human Resources Canada working, and I still see some of those people, and they enjoyed the project, but it was a big job.
Having had experience with old boats, I knew it was going to be a big project. The one plus is that it didn't have to go back in the water, but we also wanted to do a proper restoration on it. We brought it to the museum, and we got John Jordan, hired John Jordan. Howie Brown was another one, contributed. And John's experienced shipwright, and then Kevin is just an excellent carpenter, and so set to work on it and put it back the way it originally was, as close to it as we could.
Well, the shipyard that I worked in had been shut down by BC Packers, and we were just in the midst of tearing it down when I was on unemployment, and George came and found me and said, "We need your help." So that's when it started, and it was probably a little over a year and a half.
We just had a couple of photographs, and one particular one was pretty useful. I mean, it's the one we used more than anything, and we blew it up and enhanced it as best we could at the time, trying to get a better perspective on what the aft cabin looked like. And fortunately, John Jordan was familiar with the boat, and the aft cabin had actually been abandoned on a lot near their home. So he knew what it looked like. But of course, our memories are never 100%. But we did, I think, manage to make it look more or less like it would have originally.
We had pieces of the cabin and pieces, you know, to get a shape and a measurement, but other than that, it was starting from scratch. And then Buford lived just up the driveway, Buford Haynes. Mm-hmm. So whenever I got stumped, I'd walk over and talk to him. Yeah. And he'd straighten us out and away we'd go again.
There was some discussion as to what color it was, and no one was completely sure, but that's, I think, talking to the Matsunagas and John's recollections of the boat and other people's, I think we got it as close as we could. Most of the boat is original. The keel certainly is all good, prop shaft, all that, rudder, steering gear, and all of the accoutrements of the wheelhouse we put back in the original.
When we moved the boat from there to the other side, they lifted it onto a trailer and then drove it around, and then the Discovery crane actually picked it up off the trailer and swung it over top of the whole area and dropped it onto the cement that's there now, and then lifted the roof on top. Yeah, that was a big day.
I so remember the day. Mrs. Matsunaga's a tiny little lady, and her husband, the patriarch, Mr. Matsunaga, had passed away. But she was beaming as she and the family came on the boat, and we blessed the Soyokaze at where it was. And it just warmed my heart. It really did. And then they brought sushi.
The boat won a BC Heritage Award. And that day, we were all invited back to it, and I remember Mrs. Matsunaga and the daughter, Harumi, come walking around the corner, and Harumi saw me, and she talks to her mother in Japanese, and they're talking, and she goes like this. And it was talking about me when I was a little boy, and she just lit up with a big smile.
It was an honor because BC Heritage really wants it to be true to the heritage values of the boat. And George and the curatorial and collection staff made sure it was recreated as best we could with all the rotten boards and everything. But as I stood there, I knew it wasn't my award. I represented the whole museum community, the commercial fishermen, those who had worked on it, the Matsunagas, because altogether that's what made it win the BC Heritage Award.
I mean, I think they were very appreciative of what actually took place. You know, it was a long process, and they worked hard at making it happen, definitely. And we had a dinner at the Anchor Inn. The Matsunagas took us all, I mean, the staff, for sushi. And in the midst, I had made a picture frame, and we took the one picture we had and had it blown up a little bit and matted. And the picture frame was made from the wood paneling from the inside of the boat, the glass from one of the windows in the front, and the bottom of the picture frame was the actual registration number off of one of the beams. And I presented it to Mrs. Matsunaga that night.
That first Christmas afterwards, a grandson, I think at the time he was in his teens, he came in with a check from himself to give towards Grandpa's boat. And other members of the family came in with a check then as well. And they've done that every year since for the maintenance of the boat. That doesn't happen very often. And they brought gifts of smoked salmon for the staff at Christmas time every year for many years. And so I think they feel pride and ownership, and yeah, they're so pleased to see that boat there. And the sons and daughters are getting elderly, but I think it's going to pass on for many generations.
Oh, I feel good knowing that I was part of it. I mean, I'm just one part of it. There was a lot of other people that worked on this boat. And, you know, so I'm sure that everybody feels the same when they see it. And it'll be there forever, as long as it's looked after. So that's, I mean, that's a nice thing.
Proud of them coming back from where it was, you know, taking those boats away from them and stuff like that. And for them to come back the way they did, wow, that's pretty cool.
It almost seems like a sentinel of welcome, but also our Japanese-Canadian history, where a sad story became also a good story. Because the Matsunagas reintegrated back into the community, they came back to where they fished, and with no hard feelings, but they're commercial fishermen to this day. And so I think it's a turned good story.
And my dad was the only Japanese got his boat back after the war, you know. Every time I go by here, I look at it every time, going south there. Yeah. Pretty much every time I go by here, I look at the boat.